بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد سيد المرسلين وخاتم النبيين وعلى آله وأصحابه الطيبين الطاهرين ومن اتبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ولا شبيه ولا مثيل له ولا ضد ولا ند ولا جسد ولا صورة ولا أعضاء له كان الله ولا مكان فهو الآن على ما عليه كان فلا تضربوا لله الأمثال ولله المثل الأعلى تنزه ربي عن الجلوس والقعود وعن الحركة والسكون وعن الاتصال والانفصال لا يحل فيه شيء ولا ينحل منه شيء ولا يحل هو في شيء لأنه ليس كمثله شيء مهما تصورت ببالك فالله لا يشبه ذلك ومن وصف الله بمعنى من معاني البشر فقد كفر وأشهد أن سيدنا وعظيمنا وقائدنا وقرة أعيننا محمدا عبد الله ورسوله ونبيه وصفيه وحبيبه وخليله أرسله الله هدى ورحمة للعالمين هاديا ومبشرا ونذيرا وداعيا إلى الله بإذنه سراجا وهاجا وقمرا منيرا اللهم صل وسلم وأعظم وأنعم وأكرم على هذا النبي الكريم كلما ذكره الذاكرون وغفل عن ذكره الغافلون الصلاة والسلام عليك يا سيدي يا رسول الله الصلاة والسلام عليك يا سيدي يا حبيب الله الصلاة والسلام عليك يا سيدي يا عظيم الجاه. I praise Allah, I glorify and I thank Allah for all the blessings that He gives without Him being obligated to give anything. And I ask Allah Ta'ala to raise the rank of our beloved Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam and to protect his Muslim nation. I testify that no one deserves to be worshipped except Allah Ta'ala, the one without a partner, the one without an equal, the one without a similar, the one who is unlike anything in the universe and nothing in the universe is like Him. He has no father, no mother, no sister, no brother, no son, and no daughter. He exists without time and place because He is the creator of time and place. He does not reside above the throne like the Christians say, and He is not attributed with fatigue like the Jews say. Our Lord is glorified beyond any imperfection that the non-Muslims attribute to Him. Whatever you imagine in your mind, Allah Ta'ala does not resemble that. And whoever attributes an attribute of the creations to Allah is not a Muslim. And I testify that Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, the son of Abdullah, the son of Abdul Muttalib, the son of Hashim, the son of Abdul Manaf, from the tribe of Quraysh, is the best creation of Allah and His final prophet and messenger sent to all humans and jinn, and He is truthful about everything that He conveyed of the revelation. Thereafter, we remind ourselves to have the sincere intention for the sake of Allah in attending this session of Islamic knowledge, because having the sincere intention is a requirement to get the reward. So the Muslim, whenever he does a good deed, he has to have the sincere intention for the sake of Allah to get reward for that good deed. The reward is defined as the compensation that the Muslim receives in the hereafter for the good deeds that he did in this life among what makes him happy. An example of the reward that is guaranteed to the righteous Muslim in the grave is that his grave is expanded approximately 105 feet by 105 feet, and his grave is illuminated with a light similar to the light of the full moon, and the fragrance of paradise would be present in the grave. The sincere intention means for the Muslim to do the good deeds, seeking the acceptance of Allah only and not the praise of the people. So alhamdulillah, we have reached to page 103 in the book, the Lucid Word, the first edition, page 103. And we were talking about the integrals of the prayer. And we got to mentioning integral number 17. the 17th integral. So we are reading from the bottom of page 103, the third line from the bottom. So it says the 17th integral is to observe the aforementioned order of the integrals of prayer as previously enumerated. So we mentioned before this the integrals of the prayer. We mentioned to have the intention while saying Allahu Akbar. We mentioned to stand for the obligatory prayer. We mentioned to recite Al-Fatiha. We mentioned to do Al-Ruku'. We mentioned to have Al-Tuma'nina in the Ruku'. We mentioned to straighten up after the Ruku', I'tidal. We mentioned to have Tuma'nina in the I'tidal. We mentioned to make Sujood twice, and we mentioned to have Al-Tuma'nina in the Sujood. We mentioned to sit in between the two prostrations. We mentioned to have Al-Tuma'nina in this sitting. We mentioned to say At-Tashahhud, the minimum Tashahhud. And we mentioned also to say the As-Salatu ala Nabi and the closing Salam. And now we're going to talk about the 17th integral, which is to observe the order. So we have to, the integrals of the prayer, they have to be done in this order. So, therefore, the author said, therefore, intentionally neglecting it, yani the order, intentionally neglecting the order, by prematurely bringing forward a verbal integral, namely the closing salam, or a physical integral, such as intentionally prostrating before bowing, invalidates the prayer, owing to one's disregard of the prayer's sanctity. So, since the Prophet ﷺ, it was revealed to him to do the prayer in this specific way, to follow these integrals and to observe their order. So the one who does them purposely out of order, he would not be considered to be following what the Prophet ﷺ came with, and so his prayer would not be valid. Because as Muslims, when it comes to the rulings and the judgments and the rules that we have to follow them according to how the Prophet ﷺ, according to how he conveyed them to us. So we're not entitled to try and do it or to supposedly do it however we want or however we feel like. It has to be done according to the way that the Prophet ﷺ specified. So he mentions here about bringing forward a verbal integral. This is talking specifically about the closing salam. So if sometime during the prayer, before you get to the final sitting, and before you get to saying the tashahhud, and before you get to saying the as-salatu ala nabi, if the person says assalamu alaikum, they say the closing salam, their prayer would be invalid. And a physical integral, if they do a physical integral out of order, their prayer would be invalid. An example of that is like intentionally making sujood before al-ruku'. So if the person, they finish reciting al-Fatiha, and then instead of going to al-ruku', purposely, they go from finishing the Fatiha to the sujood. Their prayer would be invalid immediately. However, if one forgets to perform an integral, they must return to it. So now, we're talking about the case of a person, they were reciting al-Fatiha, for example, and by accident, meaning they while forgetting, instead of going to the ruku', they went to sujood, for example. So this is the example of this scenario that we're going to explain and talk about so that we can clarify the rule. So in the Shafi'i school, the rule is, if you forget to perform an integral while you're praying, so you do the integral out of order, but because you forgot, not intentionally, so by mistake, meaning they didn't do it on purpose, they forgot, then they must return to it. That is the forgotten integral. So if they forget to do the ruku', they go straight to the sujood, they have to return to the standing position so that they can then do the ruku'. And once they do that, now they just continue with the prayer, they continue on. So they must return to the forgotten integral and then continue on with their prayer. unless they do not remember leaving out that omitted integral until they are performing the same type of integral or what comes after it. In this case, they complete the cycle. So in this case, in this scenario, the person was reciting Al-Fatiha. Instead of going down to ruku' because they forgot, they went to sujood. While they are in sujood of that same rak'ah, they remember, oh no, I forgot to do ruku'. So what's the next step? What do they have to do? They have to come back up to the standing position and then go down to ruku' and then come back up and then go to sujood. Yani they come back to the standing position, they do the ruku' that they forgot to do, and they continue the prayer from there. They just continue with the regular flow of the prayer. So that's the first case, yani that's easy to understand. Now we're going to talk about the case where the person, they forgot to do ruku', they finished Al-Fatiha, they forgot to do ruku', and they went straight to sujood instead, and they kept on going until they did 2 sujoods, and then they get back up, and then they finish reciting Al-Fatiha. Now they remember, in the subsequent rak'ah, in the next rak'ah, now they remember that in the one before it, in the rak'ah before, they forgot to do ruku'. In this case, what do? They just continue on with the regular flow of the prayer, and what was done in between those 2 moments, it gets cancelled. And so they continue on with the regular flow of the prayer, and when they get to the end of that, or when they continue on with the regular flow of the prayer, and then they just add the rak'ah after that in the end. So this is where he explains. He says, this is because the similar integral in the current cycle took the place of the forgotten integral in the current cycle, in the previous cycle. So this is because the similar integral in the current cycle took the place of the forgotten integral in the previous cycle. Therefore, the incomplete rak'ah, which was missing an integral, is now considered complete. And what was performed in between the omitted integral and its similar in the following rak'ah is disregarded. So it wouldn't be counted, yani. It would be as if nothing happened in between those 2 moments. So again, if the person is reciting Al-Fatiha, they forget to do ruku' and they go straight to sujood, and then they sit, and then they go to sujood again, and then they stand up now for the next rak'ah, and they recite Al-Fatiha. Now they remember that in the one before, they forgot the ruku'. So what do now? They continue on with the regular flow of the prayer, and they count that this rak'ah now, it takes the place of the rak'ah that was before it. So this is where the author, he explains this also. He says, for instance, if one does not remember leaving out bowing, al-ruku', until after one bows in the subsequent cycle, or in the sujood after that subsequent bowing, then their previously incomplete rak'ah is now considered complete upon performing the aforementioned bowing. Thus, what was performed in between is nullified. So the person, this is what they do. If they are not in the next rak'ah that reached to that point where they forgot, or beyond that point, then they keep on going with the regular flow of the prayer, and they count that rak'ah now takes the place of the one before it. So let's say, if this happened in the first rak'ah, they recited Al-Fatiha, and then instead of going to ruku', they went straight to sujood because they forgot. Then they go to sujood and they sit and they go to sujood again, and they stand up now to do the second rak'ah. They finish reciting Al-Fatiha, and then they bow and they remember, before I had missed the bowing in the previous rak'ah. Now they count that they are now in the first rak'ah. And then they just continue on with the regular flow of the prayer, and they do 4 rak'ahs. So they do that one and then 3 more. So that's the end of that section. That's the end of that chapter. Now we're going to talk about the Congressional Prayer. Before we move on, are there any questions regarding this case? No.
Question. If you remember at the end, when you're doing the shahad, at the tashahhud at the end, You do an extra ruku,
You do an extra rak'ah.
an extra rak'ah,
Yes.
the complete cycle.
Yes, the complete cycle.
So you get up
You get up.
and do the complete cycle
Th-
one
cor-
second.
That's correct. No.
You know that the any mistake you have to do the extra shizda, two shizda.
Okay, that's a good question. So one of the questions was, the first question was, if you remember that you forgot when you're in the final tashahhud, you're sitting down, you're right about to say assalamu alaikum to end the prayer, and then you remember that in the beginning, or let's say in the rak'ah right before, or any of the rak'ahs, you forgot to do ruku'. So what do? What does the person do? They stand back up, they they recite al-Fatiha again, and they go to ruku', and they go with the regular flow of the prayer, and then they sit down again, and then they end the prayer. So that's the answer to the first question. Now the follow-up question to that is, isn't there some extra sujood that you're supposed to do? The answer, or that you should do? The answer is yes. It's called sujood sahu. And this is like the sujood of being absent-minded, the sujood of making an accidental mistake in the prayer. And in the Shafi'i school, the way that this works, and this is sunnah, you don't have to do it. So if you leave it out, the prayer is still valid, but it is recommended to do. So in the Shafi'i school, the way that it works is, once you finish saying, and you made up for your mistake, so you already got up and you did the extra rak'ah, so now you're sitting down and you say the tashahhud, you say as-salatu ala nabi, and right before you say assalamu alaikum, you finish saying all as-salatu ala nabi. Right before you say assalamu alaikum, you have the intention that you do two sujoods of sahu. These are called sujood sahu, the sujood of absent-mindedness, the sujood of making an unintentional mistake. And you do two sujoods. So right before you say assalamu alaikum, you go down, one sujood, you sit down, then you go down again, another sujood, then you sit down, and then immediately you say assalamu alaikum to end the prayer. Is that clear? Any questions about that before moving on? طيب. Now moving on to the Congregational Prayer. The author said, Section 18, clarifying the circumstances necessitating the congregational and Jumu'ah prayers, the conditions of the validity of the Jumu'ah prayer, and clarifying the integrals and conditions of the two speeches. Praying the 5 prayers in congregation is a communal obligation, fardu kifayatin, upon the free, sane, pubescent, resident males who are unexcused. Hence, it is not an obligation upon the impubescent women, slaves, travelers, and others who have an Islamically acceptable excuse that excludes them from being among those who are obligated to perform the 5 prayers in congregation, such as when it is raining heavily to the point that it soaks the clothing, or having fear of an enemy when going to the place where the congregational prayer is held. This communal obligation is satisfied by performing the 5 prayers in a way that the rite of the prayer be public. Then rite here in English, R-I-T-E, which means like the ritual of the prayer, that this sacred and blessed traditional act of the prayer is done in public. And this is fulfilled if the 5 ritual prayers are performed in congregation in public places that do not cause the congregators unease and timidity to enter and join. So this is good details here. So when we're talking about the 5 prayers, which prayers are we talking about? We're talking about Fajr, the dawn prayer, Dhuhr, the noon prayer, Asr, the late afternoon prayer, Maghrib, the sunset prayer, Isha, the night prayer. These are the 5 obligatory prayers. And it is a fardu kifaya, it is a communal obligation to perform these prayers in the congregation. So what does that mean? What is the fardu kifaya? What is the communal obligation? The communal obligation, it is a type of obligation. It's different than the personal obligation. It's different than al-fardu al-ayni or fardu ayn. It's different than that. The personal obligation is the obligation that every accountable Muslim must fulfill and satisfy. each individual Muslim. So if you're an accountable Muslim and there is a personal obligation, you yourself have to do it and you will be accountable for doing it. And if you don't do it, you yourself are the one that is deserving of torture. Wal-'iyadhu billah. But the communal obligation, fardu kifaya, it is a type of obligation that it's not specifically an obligation on each and every individual accountable Muslim. It is an obligation, it is a type of obligation that it is an obligation upon the community of Muslims. So if some of the Muslims in that community, they take care of fulfilling that obligation, then the others are excused. And if none of the Muslims who are obligated and who are able, if none of them do it and all of them fall short in it, then all of them would be sinful. And so performing the 5 daily prayers, the Fajr, the Dhuhr, the Asr, the Maghrib, the Isha, performing these prayers in congregation is a communal obligation upon the community. So what does that mean? And who exactly are the ones that are obligated with this? Who is the ones that this obligation is directed towards? It is an obligation upon the free, sane, pubescent, resident males who are unexcused. So, but when we say free, we exclude the slaves. So if there were any Muslim slaves in that community, they're not included in this command. They're not included in fulfilling this obligation. Yani, if it was only them who prayed the prayer in congregation, this communal obligation would not be considered that it is fulfilled. And when we say sane, we're excluding the insane. When we say pubescent, we're excluding the prepubescent children. So if they are not at the age of being pubescent, then they're excluded. So the communal obligation doesn't get fulfilled by, for example, young boys, even if they're mumayyiz, because they're not pubescent. When we say resident males, we're excluding males that are travelers, and we're excluding females. So when we say resident males, by resident, we're excluding the male that is traveling, who is currently in the judgment of traveling. So let's say someone that they came into town, someone that lives, let's say, in New York, a Muslim that lives in New York. He flew into South Florida, and he was staying, for example, for 3 days. So while he's staying in South Florida, during those 3 days, he doesn't have to. He's not included in those that are commanded to fulfill the communal obligation. He's not included amongst those that count to fulfill the communal obligation. And when we say males, we're excluding females. So if the females of the community, if they get together and they fulfill and they pray the prayers in congregation, the obligation is not lifted. The communal obligation is not fulfilled. And when we say who are unexcused, we are excluding those who have an acceptable Islamic excuse that excludes them from being among those who are obligated to perform the 5 prayers in congregation. Like what? What's an example of that? This is a famous example that is mentioned in the books of the Shafi'i Islamic law. Like when it is raining heavily to the point that it soaks the clothing. So your clothing would get soaked. This is an example. And obviously there is something that needs to be looked at for modern times in the case of, like, because you have a car. So I'm not explicitly talking about that case, but in many places, right, even nowadays, the mosque, let's say, is walking distance. Or the person, they don't have a car to go to the mosque. They'll go walking, for example. Or they will go riding a horse in a carriage, for example, even today. So if it's raining really heavily to the point where their clothes get soaked, they don't have to go. They don't have to go. And they wouldn't be included among those who the communal obligation is directed towards them because they have an excuse. Another excuse is the fear of an enemy. when going to the place where the congregational prayer is held. So this is something also that could happen nowadays. Even if you have a car, you're driving towards the place, but let's say that you're living in a country where the Muslims are persecuted, where the Muslims, they are, the people in that country that control that country, they are hostile and violent towards the Muslims. So if you're going to, let's say, the mosque and they have a checkpoint, and they check you at the checkpoint, and they see that you're Muslim, then what are they going to do to you? They're going to beat you down, or they're going to arrest you, or they're going to kill you. So in that case, this is considered an excuse. And when we say the communal obligation, how is that fulfilled? Is it fulfilled by doing the prayer inside of your house or inside of your apartment? And let's say let's say you had your pubescent son in the house, and the father and the pubescent son are in the house, or there's, let's say, a group of men living together in one house, roommates, and you get together in the living room and you pray the prayer there. Is that considered that the communal obligation is being fulfilled? No. Because the condition for the communal obligation to be fulfilled is by performing the 5 prayers in a way that this prayer that is done, this congregational prayer that is done, that it's public. And meaning public, that means that the people who are seeking to pray this prayer, they can easily access that place without feeling shy and uneasy. Because they're not going into like somebody's personal house. They're not going into somebody's living room. They're not going into somebody's room. They're going into a public place like this musalla, and they can just open the door and come on in. They don't have to knock. They just open the door and come on in, and they know that there's the adhan being called, there's the iqamah being called, the imam is there, there's a place to make wudu, so they feel comfortable coming to this place, coming specifically to this place just to pray the prayer. Any questions about that case before moving on? No. However, it is a personal obligation, fardu aynin, in the Jumu'ah prayer, Salatul Jumu'ah, upon them. Now, those same people that are communally obligated to pray the 5 prayers in congregation, those same people are personally obligated to pray the Jumu'ah prayer. Meaning those who were previously mentioned. When we say upon them, we mean those who were previously mentioned. The free, sane, pubescent, resident, unexcused males. They are personally obligated to pray the Jumu'ah. Yani, each and every single individual of them, they have to come themselves and pray the Jumu'ah. So it's not like the case of the congregational prayer. It's not like the case of praying the 5 prayers in congregation. In this case, it's a personal obligation. For the Jumu'ah, it's a personal obligation. If they were 40, we add a condition to this. If they were 40 accountable inhabitants, including the Imam, who live in buildings, whether these buildings were made out of wood, stones, or clay, not in tents, because it is not an obligation on tent dwellers. That is, it is not an obligation upon those 40 inhabitants if they were inhabitants of tents. So we add on the 40, and we also add on that they be inhabitants. What does that mean, inhabitants? It means that this place that they're living in, they have the intention to live and die in this place. So even if they, let's say, they travel abroad for business, or they travel abroad for a vacation, or they travel abroad for work, but in their intention is one day to return back to that place to live out the rest of their lives. Because it's something that is commonplace. Sometimes a person in the place where they're born or wherever they live, they don't find the suitable work, or they don't find the suitable things that they need. So they would travel abroad to go and get the things that they need. And then eventually they plan to come back to their hometown so that they can live out the rest of their lives. So wherever that place is, that's considered that the person is an inhabitant of that place. So let's say that a person, they were born in the Middle East. And then they realize that the situation in the country that they're living in is such a corrupt situation, it's such an unstable situation, the government is so severely corrupt. Even if you're a hard worker, even if you're motivated, even if you're not a lazy person, you still can't get ahead, you still won't be able to get the basic necessities that you need for you and your family. So you decide that you're going to come to America. Because they say America is the land of opportunity. In America, if you're a hard worker, you can make your way, you can make your money, and you have a certain type of freedom that you don't have in the country that you were born in. And that way you can make that money and you can accumulate and save throughout the years. But then once you reach to a certain amount, then you decide that you're going to go back. And you're going to, let's say, invest in some real estate into the place where you originally came from, and then you're going to live, for example, like retirement. So if that's the intention, then that means when that person leaves the Middle East, his hometown or the place that he's an inhabitant of, what he's considered an inhabitant, is the Middle East and not America. Even if he spends 20 years in America, 30 years in America, but his intention is to eventually one day go back to the Middle East where he came from and use what he had benefited from economically to then settle back down in his original place where he came from. So this whole time that he spends in America, it's not considered his hometown. It's not considered that he's an inhabitant of that place. He would be considered a resident as long as he's not traveling, but he's not considered an inhabitant. This is the English term inhabitant is the term that we're using to refer to what in the Islamic law they call mustawtin. المستوطن هو الذي ينوي أن لا يغادر هذا المكان صيفا ولا شتاء إلا وهو يعود إليه. فإن غادر لمدة ما إما لعمل أو لسياحة لكن في نيته أن يعود إلى هذا المكان يعني وأن يعيش في هذا المكان إلى الممات. فهذا هو يعني هذا هو وطنه هو المكان الذي هو ينوي فيه أن لا يغادره صيفا ولا شتاء إلا وهو يعود إليه يعني وإن غادره لمدة ما هو ينوي العودة إلى ذاك المكان. هذا هو الوطن. So when we say inhabitant, we're talking about the mustawtin. So if somebody is not a mustawtin and they're in the place of Jumu'ah, in order for the Jumu'ah to be valid, you have to have at least 40 of those people. 40 sane, free, pubescent, accountable, unexcused inhabitants. 40 of those. Without 40 of those in the Shafi'i school, the Jumu'ah prayer won't be valid. So imagine. Now the case is that many of the communities in the United States, that of the people that there's musallas or what they call masjids or what they call mosques, many of these communities are made up of what? Of immigrants that come from Muslim countries, that come from Afghanistan, or that come from Pakistan, or that come from India, or that come from the Middle East, or that come from Iraq, or any of these places where there's a predominantly large Muslim population. They come to America supposedly seeking a better life, and they spend, let's say, 10, 20, 30 years, but somehow eventually they intend to go back. Are they mustawtinun? Are they inhabitants? In this case, no. If there are cases that they eventually plan to go back to where they came from and be buried there, and that's where they intend to live out the rest of their life, then they are not considered an inhabitant. And the whole time that they spend in America, they're considered a resident, a muqim, someone that's not a musafir, someone that's not a traveler. So, but if there was, let's say, a place, let's say they did migrate from one of those countries, but they decided, you know what, I'm never going back to Pakistan, I'm never going back to Iraq, I'm never going back to the Middle East, I'm never going back to India, I'm going to stay in America. This is where, you know, I made my family, this is where I have my work, this is where I have my career, this is where I have my grandchildren. So khalas, they decided they're going to live out the rest of their lives in Wisconsin, wherever they landed. Now they're considered an inhabitant now of that place that they're in. So it goes by that. It goes by that intention. And when we say who live in buildings, yani these people, these 40 people, they have to be inhabitants of buildings. Yani they can't be, for example, like living like in a camp type situation with tents. Because let's say they have like, let's say a camp type situation. Yeah, they have, like, let's say a community of 50 people, they all live in tents. They don't have to pray Jumu'ah. They're not obligated to pray Jumu'ah. The Jumu'ah prayer is also obligatory upon those who were initially traveling, then intended to stay in the place of Jumu'ah for 4 complete days or more, excluding the day of entry and the day of exit, because one's travel is interrupted by that intention. So, now in the case of the person who's not an inhabitant, so let's say that in that community, you had 40 or more free, sane, pubescent, accountable, unexcused male inhabitants. So the Jumu'ah can be done. And let's say that there's 10 people in that community. They're not inhabitants. They plan to go back to their home country, but they're currently not traveling. So they're in the town of Jumu'ah. They're spending, let's say, 10 days there. They're not travelers. So what do they have to do? They're obligated to come to the Jumu'ah as well, even though they wouldn't be counted as one of the original 40 that make the Jumu'ah valid. But they are obligated to come to the Jumu'ah. It is also personally obligatory upon those who live outside the settlement of the Jumu'ah. The settlement means an area comprising of dwellings and buildings, regardless whether they were a small number or large number. Settlements include villages, towns, and cities, etc. So it is also personally obligatory upon those who live outside the settlement of the Jumu'ah prayer, even if they lived in tents, provided that they can hear the call of prayer, adhan, of a loud-voiced person standing at the closest edge of the settlement to them, wherein the Friday prayer is performed. So what does this mean? This means that, let's say that the person, let's say these people that were living in the tents, okay? These people that are living in the tents in this settlement. Let's say that there is a town close to them that does pray the Jumu'ah. A town that fulfills all the conditions, that does pray the Jumu'ah. Those people that are living in the tents, do they have to go to that place? How do we know? How do we judge? This is the way we judge. This is the metric. If, let's say hypothetically, it doesn't have to be that it's done for real. It doesn't have to be like really tested. Just hypothetically speaking, if someone with a loud voice were to stand at the edge of the town where the Jumu'ah is done, at the border of the town, and he were to call the adhan, and it wasn't windy, for example, so it was like a medium, it was like a moderate weather, not windy, because the wind carries the sound. If the people that are living in the tents, they can make out the words that are being said as the words of the adhan, they can kind of hear what's being said, and they can tell that's the adhan, then they have to go. They have to go to the Jumu'ah. They have to make their way from the tents to the town where the Jumu'ah is being done. Hence, if the call to prayer, now we're on page 107. Hence, if the call to prayer isn't audible to the outlying residents because it is being recited from the middle of the settlement, then this does not exempt them from being required to attend. It is therefore an obligation to attend, considering the outlying resident heard the adhan with normal hearing, and he recognized what he heard as the call to prayer, even if it was not coherent. Also, this is with the estimation that the call to prayer was recited on a windless day from a leveled and even surface. So in the Shafi'i school, they take all these details into consideration. And masha'Allah, you see how in the Islamic law, it is very precise. It is very, the details in it, they're very precise. So the person, they should be careful, and they should know that when it comes to implementing the rules of the religion, it's not something that you can easily just brush it off or say, well, I'm just going to do it like this, or I'm going to do it like that. You have to know exactly how to fulfill these actions. You have to know exactly how to fulfill these actions. Moving on, it says conditions for a valid Jumu'ah prayer. The conditions for a valid Jumu'ah prayer are 4. It is a condition for it to be performed within the early afternoon prayer time at dhuhr. Hence, if dhuhr time expires, it must be made up as dhuhr. So, in order for the Jumu'ah to be valid, it has to be done during the dhuhr time. If it's done outside of the dhuhr time, it won't be valid, and dhuhr must be prayed. The second condition is for the 40 inhabitants to hear the integrals of the two speeches during the prescribed time of dhuhr and before the Jumu'ah prayer. So these 40 people that we mentioned, they have to hear the integrals of the Jumu'ah, and we're going to mention what they are. The third condition is for the Jumu'ah prayer to be prayed in congregation by the aforementioned 40 inhabitants. Hence, the Jumu'ah prayer is not valid if prayed individually. So the person, they can't pray the Jumu'ah prayer alone. Lastly, it is a condition for there not to be another Jumu'ah prayer prior to it or simultaneous with it in the same settlement. So what does that mean? That means, let's say in that city where they're praying the Jumu'ah, you can't just have 5 Jumu'ah prayers in that same city. Only one Jumu'ah prayer is valid. If the opening statement, Allahu Akbar, of one Jumu'ah prayer preceded that of another, then the former would be valid, provided its precedence is known, and the latter would be invalid. The determining factor for precedence or simultaneity is by utterance of the letter Ra of the prayer's opening statement, Allahu Akbar. So what does that mean? That means that, first of all, which one is judged as being first and which one is judged as being second? The one that's being judged as first is the one where the Imam, he finishes saying Allahu Akbar to start the prayer first. So let's say that hypothetically there was a scenario where there were 2 speeches that started at the same time and they ended at the same time. And then both Imams, they stood up to say Allahu Akbar at the same time. They both started to say Allahu Akbar at the same time. But one of them, they said Allahu Akbar. He went long. And then the other one just said Allahu Akbar, and he went short. That one who went short and finished saying Allahu Akbar first, that's the one that's counted, that is first. And then the other one is invalid. And also this is the case where where the first one is valid and the second one is invalid, when you know which one was first. So the question is, how would you know which one is first? How do you know which Imam said Allahu Akbar first? Obviously, hypothetically speaking, there are scenarios where you can figure that out with today's technology. You have someone, let's say, that's in one place with their phone, like on the phone call, and like a video call, and the other person is in another place on a video call, and both of them are waiting for their Imams to say Allahu Akbar, and they just compare that way, for example. But is that something that's religiously considered? But anyway, so let's say that there was a way to know. The one that we know is first, that's the one that's valid, and the one that we know is second, that's the one that's invalid. In the case where you don't know which one was first or which one was second, it's up in the air. It could be this one, it could be that one. Both of them are invalid. Some Shafi'i scholars said that this is the case if the people were able to congregate in one place but neglected to do so. So this rule about that you can't have more than one Jumu'ah in one settlement, one city, one town, one village. Some Shafi'i scholars, they said that this rule applies only when everyone that is obligated to pray the Jumu'ah can fit and congregate in one place, and they neglected to do so. So that rule about first and second, some Shafi'i scholars, it said it only applies to that. So they said, however, if it is hard for them to congregate in one place, then it is permissible to hold as many Jumu'ah prayers as are needed, and then both the former and the latter would be valid. So some Shafi'i scholars, they said, if there's so many people in that town that are obligated to pray Jumu'ah, and the facility that they're praying that Jumu'ah in doesn't fit all of them, then they said it's permissible to have one Jumu'ah and then another Jumu'ah if needed to fit the other amount of people, but not beyond that number. So let's say if with 2 Jumu'ahs, everybody would be covered, everybody would be included. You can't have a third, for example. So it's not like you can have 2 and 3 or 4 or as many as you'd like throughout the day. It's just for the need. But remember, some Shafi'i scholars, they didn't consider that to be a condition. They said if there's too many people, if there's not too many people, they pray in the street. And they shut the street down. And they shut the city down. Because anyways, there's specific rules that are to be followed between the first adhan, after the first adhan of the Jumu'ah is called. When the adhan for the Jumu'ah is called, I'll say that. When the adhan for the Jumu'ah is called, there's certain things that are forbidden to do for those that are obligated to pray the Jumu'ah. They cannot busy themselves with something other than getting to the Jumu'ah at that point. Once the adhan for the Jumu'ah is called, it is prohibited, it is sinful for those who are obligated to pray the Jumu'ah to busy themselves with something other than getting to the Jumu'ah. No.
What about the street where I used to live? We have like a musalla, like a musalla and the mosque, 2 musallas and the mosque. And from what I remember, the Jumu'ah was at the same time.
You've.
Yeah.
And the mosque didn't fit all the people?
It was like 3 floors.
And they have to figure out their situation. And that rule still applies. If it was the case that there was, it doesn't fit all the people, then they can do more than 1 Jumu'ah. Any questions about that before moving on? Now we're going to talk, yes. The difference is that the resident, the place where he intends to die, the place where he intends to be buried is not that town. His intention is to go back to, let's say, Palestine and live the rest of his life there and die there. The resident is someone that's just there for, let's say, 1 year or 2 years or 3 years. Yeah, so when we talk about, that's a good question. When we talk about villages or cities or towns in the Islamic context, we're talking about a place that it is, let's say, like a cluster of buildings that are connected, that are somewhat connected, and that there is no separation between the residential buildings, between those residential buildings. All of that is considered a town. So it's not just what the non-Muslims, what they define as city limits. Like if you go from, let's say, Dania Beach to Fort Lauderdale or to Hollywood, all of that is considered the same town. There's no separation that happens. Yes. No, in the Shafi'i school, for the validity of the Jumu'ah prayer, it does not have to be waqf. No.
So there's not
In that case, the person, they would pray Jumu'ah according to a different Imam. And even there's some sayings in the Shafi'i school that go as low as 15. The integrals of the 2 speeches are 5. The first 3 integrals are praising Allah, Hamdullahi, by using the particular phrases Alhamdulillah or Lillahi alhamd, or what is similar, like Hamdan Lillah. So this has to be said in the Shafi'i school as an integral of the Friday speech. Yani for the Friday khutbah to be valid, the person has to say Alhamdulillah or Lillahi alhamd or Hamdan Lillah or something similar. And as-salatu ala nabi by saying Sallallahu ala Muhammad or Allahumma salli ala Muhammad, or what is similar. The person has to say that as well. And commanding the attendants to be God-fearing by urging the people to be obedient and to avoid sinning, or either of the two. So, and saying Alhamdulillah, As-salatu ala Nabi, and enjoining God-fearingness are mandatory in both speeches. So both speeches have to have these three integrals. The fourth integral is reciting from a verse from Al-Quran that has a sought meaning in either of the two speeches. Therefore, it is not sufficient to recite what is similar to Ayah 21 of Surah Al-Muddathir. ثُمَّ نَظَرْ. The fifth integral is supplicating Allah for the believers in the second speech, such as saying, Allahumma ghfir lil mu'minina wal mu'minat, which means, Oh Allah, forgive the believers. The conditions for the validity of the two speeches, in addition to what was mentioned before, are 7. The first condition is purification from both states of ritual impurity, that is, the minor and major ritual impurities, along with purification from non-exempted najis filth on the body, place, and what is carried by the speaker, clothes, and the like. So the one who's giving the speech, he has to have purification just like the one who is praying. And he has to avoid having unexempted najis filth on his body or on his clothes or on the place where he is standing. Yani the place where he's standing has to be free from unexempted najis filth. The second condition is to cover the unlawful nakedness awrah. The awrah is the area of one's body that is shameful to expose. And that is the area between the navel and the knees for the men, as was mentioned before. The third condition is to stand while giving the two speeches if able. So the same thing as in the prayer. If you're able to stand, you have to stand. If you're unable to stand but you're able to sit, you're allowed to sit while giving the speech. However, it is better in this case to let someone who is able to stand to do the prayer. The third condition is to stand. I'm sorry, I read that already. Condition 4 is to sit between the two speeches for at least the duration of al-tuma'nina. So when the first speech is done, the speaker sits down and for a moment. He has to pause for a moment. And the sunnah is to pause for an amount of time to recite Surah Al-Ikhlas and to actually recite Surah Al-Ikhlas. The fifth and sixth conditions are to observe the succession without what is considered normally a lengthy interruption by that which is not related to the speeches, between the integrals of the two speeches as well as between the two speeches and the prayer. And the seventh condition is to say the integrals of the two speeches in Arabic. So how, in the Shafi'i school, how does the two speeches, how short can they be? They can be as short as Alhamdulillah, As-salatu was-salamu ala Muhammad, Ittaqullah. Then the person sits down. He recites an ayah too. He says, Qul huwa Allahu ahad. Then he sits down, pauses, he gets up, he says, Alhamdulillah, As-salatu was-salamu ala Muhammad, Ittaqullah, Allahumma ghfir lil mu'minina wal mu'minat. And he goes to do the iqamah and he starts the prayer. So the Friday speech can be as short as that. But the Friday speech, since it is a time where usually people that they don't come to the mosque, so it is a good opportunity to say something beneficial, to teach something beneficial. So that's why you see that the Friday speeches, after they do these integrals, then they give some material, they give a lecture about something. Usually about the creed or about encouraging the Muslim to be better, etc. Something that is relevant to the lives of the Muslims and something that is important for them to know, because they're coming for the Jumu'ah anyway. And then after that they do the prayer. So there cannot be any interruption between the integrals that's considered a long interruption that's not related to the speeches. So the person can, for example, say Alhamdulillah, As-salatu was-salamu ala Muhammad, then get off the minbar, go and let's say make a cup of coffee, and then come back to the minbar. he has to have a succession in between the integrals, and he has to have a succession in between finishing the speeches and actually starting the prayer. And we'll end here for today. The next section tomorrow, inshallah, we're going to talk about the conditions of following the Imam in the prayer. Very important information that we need to know and that we need to understand to make sure that we're doing the prayer properly. If there are no questions, we will conclude. طيب نهلل لا إله إلا الله اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم رب اغفر لي وللمؤمنين والمؤمنات وبارك الله فيكم.